Well, it's great to be here with all of you, and I hope you had a wonderful and blessed Thanksgiving celebration last week. I know we sure did, but I will happily confess this morning that I really love Christmas time. I really do. I love the time with family. I love the decorations. I love the food and the celebrations at church and all of the Christmas songs that we sing. As a pastor and as a husband and father and as a traditional American guy, I will admit it. I love everything about Christmas. And that's why I love celebrating the season of Advent. Advent, if you don't know, is a special time that has been celebrated for thousands of years. Really, it's a season, a special season of preparation for the arrival of Christ, the Messiah. And it is traditionally marked by candle lightings and wreaths and ornaments that all remind us to go into the Christmas holiday season excited not only about what God has already done, but in anticipation of what God is going to do. So today, November 29th, is the day that we begin our preparation for the coming of Christ here at Journey Christian Church. And not only here, all around the world, millions of people are celebrating the first Sunday of Advent for 2020. And the tradition calls this the Sunday of Hope. This is the week where we get to express the hope that we have in knowing that Christ not only came, but that he will also come again at his second advent. And to help us do that, what we're going to do is discuss some of the amazing predictions and prophecies, or really the promises from God that lead up to Christ's first advent. It's the day that we all celebrate as Christmas Day. One of my mentors in the faith, a professor at Milligan University, always used to tell me, remember, Robert, you can't teach about Christ's second coming until you have already successfully taught about his first coming. And so it's more than simply discussing the manger, the Virgin Mary, the wise men, which of course we all, they're fun to talk about at Christmas time, and it's all significant stuff. But what we're really going to do here is we're going to look at the story before that story. Because here's the thing, we all have a story that makes us who we are. None of us woke up this morning and decided to be the person we are today. You didn't get out of bed today and decide, okay, so today I'll have these positive skills and these attributes, and along with that, I'll also have all these negative attributes and habits and issues and all the emotional baggage, right, that I carry around at this particular moment in time, or these particular opinions, or this outlook about life and my place in it. None of us woke up today and decided that, because the truth is who you are at this very moment in time, that is the sum total of the decisions that you have made throughout your life and the decisions that were made by others that impacted you, and the relationships that you've had, right? And all the relationships that you've lost in the past, not to mention all of the things that you have achieved and all of the things that you have experienced and all the things that you have failed at. All of that, every bit of it, is what goes into making you who you are at this very moment in time. And that's how it goes with everyone on the planet. You're no different than anybody. This is how it works. So in a way, we all have sort of a prequel or a backstory that makes us who we are. And that prequel sets up the story of who we actually are today. And in fact, you can only really know a person if you know their full story, including their prequel, right? The more you know a person, the more you understand their backstory and their history and their background, the more you will actually know that person. Isn't that right? And so to the degree that we don't know a person's prequel or backstory or history, well then, who they really are, that will just remain a mystery to us. Everyone has a prequel, and the same thing is true of Jesus, the Redeemer sent by God, the one that we celebrate at this time of year, having been born in a stable in Bethlehem on that very first Christmas morning so long ago. But you need to understand, it wasn't like God just said one day, you know what, I think today I'll set aside my deity and become a human being, and then I'll go down there to the world that I made, and I'll just get myself martyred. That's not how it happened at all. It wasn't an on-the-spot decision. It wasn't a knee-jerk decision that God made. And it was not plan B because Adam and Eve had messed up so badly. There's actually a story that leads up to the story of the very first Advent, that very first Christmas morning. And as it turns out, God didn't just randomly choose a place to be born either. He didn't roll the dice and end up with Mary and Joseph as earthly foster parents. It really wasn't like that at all. Like all of us, there's a story before the story, a prequel. And if you really want to understand Christmas, listen to me. You need to understand the backstory, the story before the traditional story of Christmas. So we're calling this series Christmas BC, Christmas Before Christ. And over the next few weeks, we're going to be looking at that prequel and all the BC stuff that actually led up to the birth of Christ. And I know the idea of Christmas before Christ seems maybe a little bit silly, maybe a little bit illogical, but what we're going to see is that Christmas is not just another holiday on our calendars. It's not just a good reason to get together with family and friends and share some great food. And I mean, let's face it, eat too much, right? Because we all will. December is not a month to begin a diet, that's for sure. And it's not just an excuse to spend too much money on gifts to give to those that we care about and then go out and sing our favorite Christmas songs. And many of us around Christmas will sit and we'll watch these great Christmas programs, these special movies and programs that are traditional, just so awesome and nostalgic and very comforting. And while Christmas may very well be a good reason to do all those things, and listen, I think those are all great things. I'm going to do all of that. But Christmas is ultimately, in reality, the collision of two worlds. It is the collision of the spiritual world and the physical world. And listen, that collision, that event, it changed absolutely everything. And so what I want to do this morning for all of us is kind of go back as far as we can go to a time actually before time and take us back to the very beginning and ask the question, when did the idea of the incarnation of Christ first occur to God? And why did it occur? What was the master plan behind this whole thing? So we're going to step back into a time when God was actually laying out this master plan, long before God called Abraham out of the wilderness, and long before any of the prophets even predicted the very first advent of the Messiah, not days and months before the birth of Christ, but actually centuries prior to that world-changing event, the collision of these two worlds that we call Christmas. And as we get started, I just think it's right that I take a little bit of time and sort of give you the secular history of Christmas, because it's pretty interesting in and of itself. We all know that the 25th of December is celebrated around the world as Christmas Day. But why? Why December 25th? Well, actually, for the first 300 years after the crucifixion and resurrection of Christ, for the first Christians and for the New Testament church, Christmas wasn't in December at all. Did you know that? In fact, the people in that time and place, Christmas wasn't really on their calendar at all. And it's kind of difficult for us as American Christians to imagine Mary and Joseph trudging all the way to Bethlehem in anything but a bitter, cold, midwinter day, just surrounded by piles of snow, right? That's what all the nativity scenes and all the pictures and stuff. I mean, to us, Christmas and December are synonymous. But for the first 3 centuries of the Christian faith, Christmas wasn't in December. And in fact, Christmas wasn't even on the calendar at all. So when was a December 25th Christmas first even celebrated? Well, it's kind of hard to tell, but historically, the personal journal of a Roman bishop was discovered a number of years ago. And in it, there are these Latin words that appear for an entry on the 25th of December in the year 336 AD. And that bishop wrote this: 25 December, Natis Christus in Bethlehem, Judea. And the translation is, December 25th, Christ was born in Bethlehem in Judea. This day, December 25th, 336 AD, is actually the very first historical recorded Christmas observation of what became known as Christmas Day. But honestly, no one really knows, what day Christ was born. Nobody knows Jesus' birthday. A 6th century monk named Dion Exiguus was the first guy to date all of history, starting from December 25th, the year of our Lord, one, I guess. Right? Others have given dates for Christ's birth as early as mid-November. And some even say it was as late as mid-March. It probably was not December 25th. So why then did Christmas come to be celebrated on December 25th? Well, cultures around the Mediterranean and all across of Europe had historically observed these feasts all around December 25th for many years, most likely because of the winter solstice. And other cultures all around the world celebrated around December 25th too. For example, the Jewish people, they have a festival called the Festival of Lights. The Germans have what they call a Yule festival. Celtic legends connected with the winter solstice with a guy named Baldur, the Scandinavian sun god, who was struck down, by the way, by a mistletoe arrow. And the pagan festival of Saturnalia, the Roman people, they feasted and they gave gifts to each other. And at some point, it seems like a Christian bishop sort of adopted that day, most likely to keep people from indulging in these old pagan festivals by giving them something else to focus on. And obviously, if you look around, many of the pagan customs became associated with the celebration of Christmas. And Christmas stories and ideas replaced mythological ones, but many of the same practices hung on. And they do to this very day. Candles continue to be lit, feasting still takes place, gifts are still given, and kissing under the mistletoe. That all remains. But over the years, gift exchange kind of became connected with a man named St. Nicholas, a very real and legendary figure of the 4th century, by the way. He's a real person. He was a very, very generous man. And what he would do is around the winter solstice, around December, he would throw gifts into homes at night all around Christmas time. And then around the 13th century, and this is one I really like, Christians added, in my opinion, one of the most pleasant touches to all of our Christmas celebrations when they began to sing Christmas carols. And no one is sure exactly when the Christmas tree came into the picture, but it undoubtedly originated somewhere in Germany. And the 8th century English missionary, St. Boniface, he was a guy who was a missionary to Germany, and supposedly, I don't know this for a fact, but I've read that, supposedly at one point he holds up a small evergreen tree as a symbol of the everlasting Christ. And when the German people came to England, well, the Christmas tree came with them. And then when various peoples began coming to America, well, they just brought their traditions and their holiday calendars with them as well. What I find interesting is that the Christian Puritans who came to America, they actually forbid the celebration of Christmas Day because they considered it to be too pagan. Governor Bradford, who just last week we were praising because of Thanksgiving and his Thanksgiving proclamation, actually threatened New Englanders with jail or fines if they were caught celebrating Christmas. Talk about an out-of-control governor. It sounds a little bit like the governors we have today, right? Canceling Thanksgiving and Christmas and all that. But anyways, over time, it became more and more acceptable to celebrate Christmas, and it continued to sort of evolve into what it is today. That's the secular history of Christmas. But for those of us who are Christians, for those of us who worship God, Christmas has been and always will be about remembering and celebrating the very first advent or arrival of Christ and the love and grace that motivated God to send his son to inhabit our world and walk among us as a man. And so from a Christian perspective, if we're going to look at Christmas, we begin stepping back into time, not to 336 AD, but really back to, like I said, a time even before time. And if you look this up, we're talking about a time before even the creation of the world. In 1 Peter chapter 1, it says this: He, Christ, was chosen before the creation of the world. That's what it says. And he was revealed in these last days for our sake, for us. Revelation chapter 13, verse 8 says this way: Jesus is the Lamb who was slain before the creation of the world. In 1 Corinthians chapter 2, verse 7, the Apostle Paul lays it out like this. He says, we speak of God's secret wisdom, a wisdom that has been hidden and that God destined for our glory before time even began. All of these verses are talking about Christ Jesus, the Messiah. And what we see here is that it was always part of God's plan to have Jesus come to the earth as a man, long before the earth was even created. And those are great verses, right? You might be saying, well, those are great verses, but those were all written after Jesus had already come. And you're right. And so you may be wondering, is there any mention of Christ in the Bible before he actually came on that very first Christmas day, whenever that happened to be? And the answer to that question is yes, many times. And one of them was about 600 years before Christ was born, a faithful man named Isaiah, a man who served as one of God's prophets to the people. Isaiah wrote this talking about the promised Messiah's arrival in the future. Isaiah chapter 7, verse 14 says, "Therefore the Lord himself shall give you a sign. Behold, a virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and they shall call his name Emmanuel." This verse actually says that his name, he will be called Emmanuel, which literally means God with us. John expounds on this prophecy a little bit in John chapter 1, verses 1 and 2, and in verse 14, it says this: "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God, and the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we saw his glory as the only begotten Son from the Father, full of grace and full of truth." So Jesus, John tells us, is God in the flesh. The Apostle Paul says in Colossians that Christ is the actual visible image of an invisible God, and that he existed before anything was created, and he is supreme over all creation. He is the eternal one who made himself to be lower than the angels, to come in fellowship with his very own creation. So this verse in John is actually the fulfillment of the prophecy that we see written in Isaiah. Isaiah prophesies that the one born of the virgin would be called God with us. And John clearly says that Jesus, who was with us, also is God. So amazingly, we see it predicted or prophesied long before it took place. And then we actually get to see that it came to pass exactly as predicted. During this time of year, you'll hear many people giving their predictions about what next year might look like. It always happens towards the end of the year. People are always making their predictions about what the future may hold for us. We pretty much all have an interest in trying to imagine, what might happen in the future. I guess people always have, but it's difficult. It's difficult to even know what's going to happen tomorrow, especially with all the crazy stuff going on in our world of 2020, right? A famous physicist once said, "Prediction is a very difficult art, especially when it involves the future." I remember back when I was a kid in junior high school. I grew up in California. I was in California, junior high school. Experts were all predicting that there would be this huge earthquake along the San Andreas Fault, which runs right along California. And they said that this earthquake, they told us, it would completely sever part of California from the United States, and it would just become this, it would float away, I guess, and become this big island. And they were absolutely sure that this huge earthquake was going to take place within the next 10 years. And I remember as a kid, people were nervous and people were scared. It was on the news all the time. People even sold their property and moved because they were afraid of this earthquake. But obviously, if you pull up Google Maps and you look at it, you'll clearly see that 45 years later, it hasn't happened yet, has it? They got that one wrong. You know why? Well, because prediction is a very difficult art, especially when it involves the future. I remember former Vice President Al Gore in 2007, he said, this is his quote, "The northern polar ice cap is falling off a cliff." He said, "The polar ice cap will be completely gone during the summer of 2017. But 13 years later, after this bold cataclysmic warning, far from vanishing, the Arctic ice cap has actually expanded now for several years in a row. And it has increased in size ever since. You know why? Because prediction is a very difficult art, especially when it involves the future. Now, having said that, while it's difficult, if not impossible for us to predict the future, God is really good at it. And the Bible is absolutely packed with predictions and prophecies and promises that will come to pass. And many of them actually have. And it's really fascinating if you study it. Unique among any book ever written, the Bible accurately forecasts specific events in just amazing detail. And many years, sometimes even centuries before they actually occur. Biblical experts will tell you that there are approximately 2,500 prophecies that appear in the pages of the Bible. And that about 2,000 of those, listen, 2,000 of those have already been fulfilled to the letter. That is just astonishing when you look at it. The remaining 500 or so reach into the future and may be seen unfolding as days go by. In fact, we may actually in our lifetimes see some of these prophecies come to pass. Now, having said all that, the Old Testament, you need to know, was written over about a 1,500-year period by a lot of different people who lived in a lot of different places. And there are about 12,000 predictions found in the pages of the Old Testament, and over 300 of those reference the coming Messiah. This was a big theme in the Old Testament. Every single one of them, every single one of these 300 prophecies concerning the coming Messiah were fulfilled in the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. And we don't have time to look at each and every one of those. That would take too long. But in this series, I'm going to tell you what, we're going to look closely at 4 or 5 of them. I mean, as many as I can get in there. And try to understand what Christmas is really all about based upon these amazing Old Testament prophecies. But before we get into the first one, let me make sure you understand the significance of this, because numbers like that are just, hard for us to understand. Most of these 300-some prophecies, though, were written down more than 500 years before Jesus was even born. These 300 prophecies were written years and years and years, not in weeks or months before, but hundreds of years before. In Lee Strobel's excellent book called The Case for Christ, which, if you haven't read it, you need to, okay? It's an excellent book. It's a great book. And Lee Strobel, he was an atheist. He was actually a very avowed atheist. And he had a degree in journalism, and then he had a law degree from Yale University, very smart guy. He was working as the editor of the Chicago Tribune legal section. But while he was doing that, his wife somehow met some friends, and they ended up connecting with other friends, and she became a Christian. Well, being the atheist that he was and the man that he was, he wanted to investigate this. So he decided to investigate the Christian faith from a legal perspective, and then he was going to show his wife why she was just silly to believe in any of this mumbo jumbo. And in the process of his journalistic investigation, you know what happened? He became a Christian. And he says he became a Christian because the evidence for Christ was just so overwhelming. And in his book, he points out that the probability of just 8, let's say you only had 8 of these 300 prophecies being fulfilled by one person, is like one chance in 100 million billion, which is hard for us to even picture that. That's a number, it's millions of times greater than the total number of human beings that have ever walked on the face of the earth, okay? Lee Strobel then quotes an expert mathematician named Peter Stoner, and you can look this up. He's a guy who calculated the probability of one person fulfilling 48, just 48 of the 300 prophecies that Jesus fulfilled. And it comes out to, I wrote it down here, it comes out to one chance in a trillion, 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 trillion. I don't know about you. That's a number. That's a huge number that I can't even comprehend. But that alone gives me confidence that our Christian faith is reasonable. It's not a leap of faith. It is a reasonable step of faith. And it gives me confidence that, A, the Bible is inspired by God. It must be, because it is so completely trustworthy. There is no way mathematically that people could have made this all up and predicted this stuff and then it came to pass. And theologically speaking, the Old Testament points to what we call the first Christmas. It is a prequel of the Advent. And so the New Testament then basically fulfills what these prophets of old were talking about. And B, it gives me confidence that Jesus Christ is exactly who he claimed to be. Those fulfilled prophecies give solid confirmation of his credentials and show us that Jesus is who he claimed to be. He's God incarnate, God in the form of a man. And with all that in mind, do you want to see just this very first prediction? The very first prediction you can find about Jesus, the Messiah, in the Bible. Well, it's not surprisingly found in the book of Genesis, the very first book of the Bible, Genesis, the book of beginnings, in chapter 3, verse 15. This is God speaking after Adam and Eve had sinned, and so God said this to the serpent, that is Satan, right? The enemy of God and our enemy as well. In passing judgment on Satan as part of the curse, God says, I will cause hostility between you and the woman, between your seed and her seed. He will crush your head and you will bruise his heel. This is the very first prophetic promise given right after Adam and Eve had sinned in the Garden of Eden. It's also referred to as the first gospel sermon ever preached on the face of the earth. And it was preached by God. Theologians call it the proto-evangelium, or the very first gospel message. These words, spoken by God, contain the earliest promise of the redemption that Christ would bring in the entire Bible. You could correctly say that everything else in Scripture flows from this declaration by God. These words amazingly contain the plan of salvation. It's a simple plan. The great English preacher Charles Simeon called this verse the sum and summary of the whole Bible. And I don't know why we have to make it so complicated, folks. And I know some people don't like to really consider the book of Genesis. Many people sort of discount the first 11 chapters of it altogether, often because they can't make it line up with their modern scientific worldview of today. It sounds like fables and myths. And so because of that, they discount it altogether as sort of biblical myths, as symbolic. They're just symbolic in nature. But Jesus actually quoted the book of Genesis more than he quoted any other book of the Bible. Do you know that? Jesus quoted Genesis a lot. And the inescapable truth is that Jesus came here to overturn the curse that was pronounced way back in Genesis when Adam and Eve fell. And so that's why I think you can't ignore the teachings of the opening chapters of the Bible if you hope to understand the true meaning of Christmas. Although you might not see it at first glance, Jesus is actually mentioned in this first verse. In this verse here, the Messiah is actually mentioned. He is the promised seed of the woman, born of a virgin, who would come one day and absolutely crush the serpent's head. So, however, this verse does say, though, that in the process, his heel would be bruised. In short, this verse predicts that Jesus would win the ultimate victory over Satan, but in the process, he himself would be wounded. Because this verse is so important in not only the history of Christmas, but really in the history of our faith, we all need to understand something about its context. This verse actually takes place near the beginning of human history, right? In the creation. Not God history, okay? Just our history. Adam and Eve had ignored God's clear directions, and now sin had entered into paradise. And the first impulse they have is to try to hide from God, right? When confronted, their first impulse is to try to hide from God. Their second impulse is to make excuses for what they did. Some things, I guess, never change. That's exactly how we often respond, isn't it? If you read the whole thing, you'll see that when confronted by God, Adam blames Eve. He says to God, this woman that you gave me, and Eve blames the serpent. Seems like no one is willing to stand up and say, you know what, I blew it. It's my fault. It's my fault. I take responsibility. And so suddenly, this glorious garden is not quite as beautiful anymore. The incident effects of sin ruin paradise. I've always kind of imagined that watching from under a nearby tree, the serpent lies there quietly. He alone is pleased by what has taken place. He takes delight in what is happening here because this was his goal from the very beginning. He sought to humiliate God by doing whatever he could to ruin paradise. And now it looks like he's accomplished that, right? He's shown the whole universe that God's great experiment would not work, that no race of beings, even those made in his very own image, could ever be trusted to freely obey God. But as God surveys the moral wreckage of this fall from grace, he immediately begins to deliver judgment. He begins where the sin began, with the serpent. Later on, he'll get to the woman and then to the man. But I think it's significant that he speaks to the serpent first. God is the speaker, and the serpent is the one being spoken to. In Genesis chapter 3, verse 14, God passes judgment on the serpent for his part in the fall of humanity. First, God says he's cursed above every other animal. Second, the serpent will now crawl on his belly forever. And third, he'll eat the dust all the days of his life. The bad news for the serpent is that there is no good news. There is no good news for him at all. Notice God doesn't ask him why he did it or what made him decide to do that. In some ways, the fall of mankind does mark Satan's most successful moment, right? When he deceived Eve and then Adam chose to willfully follow her in sin, he wrecked God's plan and he gained the whole world for himself, he thought, but only for a time. For a short time, Satan won the battle with God. But his victory was short-lived because ever since then it's been going downhill for him. Watch what Genesis 3:15 predicts. With that understanding of context, we can consider Genesis 3:15 to find out what it really predicts for Christ and for us. We could summarize it in three short phrases. First, this verse tells us that there will be endless conflict. The fact is, you and I, we were born into a world at war. And you know what? That war has been raging long before any of us were even here. It started long before anybody ever lived, including Adam and Eve, for that matter. It started at some point that is completely undefined by Scripture. Back when God threw Satan out of heaven, and it's detailed in Ezekiel chapter 28, verse 17. Addressing Satan then, God said this, "Your heart became proud because of your beauty, and it corrupted your wisdom because of your splendor. So I threw you to the earth." Satan, we come to find out at one time, was a really great servant of God. He was a wonderful servant of God, but pride welled up in him. He was filled with pride, and he actually wanted to not serve God, but he wanted to be God. He wanted to be served, and so he formed a rebellion. And that rebellion, listen, it's still raging to this very day. And that's why God expelled him from his presence. In Isaiah chapter 14, it says, "How you have fallen from heaven, O morning star, son of dawn, you are brought down to the grave, to the depths of the pit." So there's ongoing conflict. And here's the thing. This verse also tells us that there will be a temporary defeat. God then says to the serpent, yes, you will strike his heel, but that's not the end of it. Now, heel trouble, if you've never had it, it'll slow you down, but it doesn't kill you. You can live with heel problems, even though you may have to hobble around for a little while. What Christ did was, when he died on the cross as a payment for you and for me, yes, Satan had struck his heel. On that Friday at about sundown, when they took the lifeless body of Jesus down from the cross, it appeared that Satan had won the battle, didn't it? But on Sunday morning, the true victor walked out of the grave still alive. No doubt Satan thought that he had thrown a knockout punch, but you know what? He was wrong. All he did was strike the heel of Jesus. And as painful as that was, the suffering was nothing compared to what Satan would do or have done to him by Jesus, because this verse also tells us that there will be eventual victory. When it says he will crush your head, that's how the Bible says it. The cross was actually God's death blow to Satan. It was the payback for the fall. Victory, as predicted so long ago, belonged to the woman's seed, the virgin birth. That leads us to this question, and it's a question a lot of us ask as we look around the world. If Satan has been crushed, why is there so much evil still in the world? I mean, 2,000-some years later, the world is still a very messy place, and this battle is still going on. From our perspective, the battle continues to this very day. And we see effects of it all around us. There's still evil in the world, so what's the deal? And the answer is that the victory over death on the cross defeated Satan, and his sentence was pronounced at that moment, but that sentence has not yet been carried out. In the end, he will be destroyed, and all of those who follow him will be judged also. But let's wrap it up for today. Considering all of these things and how they apply to us, and just this very first promise, this is just the first one. Genesis 3:15 means to us that the Christian life will be a struggle. And the word there, struggle, it implies effort, sweat, exertion, difficulty. That's why the Apostle Paul, when he's talking about our walk of faith and as being disciples, he talks about a boxer, a wrestler, a soldier, a runner. The Christian life isn't easy. It takes hard work that demands your full commitment and your full engagement, the full engagement of your soul. I remember when I first got saved, I thought my life would get easier. It doesn't. You still have to live here, and it's still going to be a struggle. Until the day we die or Christ returns, we will struggle against temptation. Sometimes we'll win. Other times we'll lose. But we have to be in the fight. Don't get discouraged because life isn't easy. Determined to be fully devoted to Christ no matter how hard it gets, no matter what you go through. It's not supposed to be easy. I mean, remember, folks, like I said, we are at war. We're actually behind enemy lines. Life is hard. Times are difficult. And the enemy is attacking on every side. But this also means that we have all been offered an amazing gift. You want to talk about Christmas presents? Genesis 3:15 is the first mention of Christmas in the entire Bible. You might have missed it because the name Jesus isn't in the text, but he's there nonetheless. And this gift is offered to each and every one of us. It's offered to you and to me, and it's offered not just once a year on Christmas morning. It's offered to everyone every day because Jesus is the promised seed of the woman, born of the virgin, who would one day make his entrance into this world in the most unexpected and unlikely way. He arrived on earth as a helpless little baby, a virgin birth that we celebrate and call Christmas. And now he offers each one of us a gift that is wrapped up with our name on it. And it was wrapped up way back in Genesis. It is the perfect Christmas gift. And that, my friends, is the beginning of Christmas before Christ even came. And that's the hope that we have, even in difficult times. I'm going to have the worship team come up here.